Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm really looking forward to sharing this information with you and also hearing what you all have to say. I talked about this a little before, but I'm Abby. I'm an honors student here at Edgewood. This presentation today is actually part of an honors project that I've been working on this whole semester. And originally, I was interested in looking at the challenges and oppression that trans people face in America, specifically Black trans women, and focusing on their representation and strong community resistance. But as we got more into 2021, it became clear with the horrifying number of anti-trans legislation being proposed that I needed to focus on this and the importance of sharing this information with others. Just a reminder that I will be recording this presentation today and that it's going to be posted to the Edgewood Engage site on the Edgewood's library page. So feel free to have your cameras on or off, whatever makes you most comfortable. Before we begin, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that Edgewood College is located on the traditional territory of the Ho-Chunk Nation. The Ho-Chunk people have always been here, and in an 1832 treaty, they were forced to begin ceding this land. Despite this, they are still here today with strong communities. I want this to serve as a reminder to the commitment of honoring and respecting the land which we are on and the sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation. Just as a heads up, today I will be talking about issues related to mental health and suicide, and I know this is a heavy topic in general, so if you need to step away or turn me down for a moment, please do what is best for you. I've also included some resources here like NAMI, which is an organization in Dane County that offers support for any mental health support, as well as the LGBTQ National Hotline Service. Both of those websites and hotlines are listed here. All right, so playing sports as a child and an adolescent is an integral part of developing friendships, learning the power of cooperation, and finding confidence in yourself and your abilities. Across 33 state legislators, there's at least 117 bills that propose restricting transgender youth's rights, with many of them banning trans girls from participating in sports. Some of these bills go further and ban trans youth from receiving the necessary gender-affirming healthcare. These bills are being introduced with unprecedented speed in 2021, and 4 of them have already passed, including an additional state executive order. For my research, I waited right until this presentation to list the current number of states and bills proposed as it changes daily. In this presentation, I argue that these bills are extremely dangerous for trans people. Trans youth already face discrimination and bullying that causes disproportionately high levels of mental illness, and these bills reinforce the idea that trans youth do not belong, leading to even more consequences for their mental health. Today, we're going to look more closely at what these bills are, how and why I believe they're being proposed, what I see the effects of them being, and what's currently being done to combat them. So one of the main forms of these bills, which I'll be focusing on today, are the trans sports bans. While each bill is slightly different, they all dictate that children must participate on the sports teams that aligns with their sex assigned at birth. These bills directly target trans girls, and it means they either have to play on the boys' team to endure the harmful experience of not being respected for who they are, or not participate in sports at all. 3 states have already signed these bills into law, including Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Just yesterday, North Dakota's legislature passed a bill that is going to the governor's desk, and there are also bills on governor's desks in West Virginia, Kansas, and soon Montana. On top of this, South Dakota's governor has also signed an executive order for a trans sports ban. Last year, one of these bills passed in the state of Idaho, but the court struck it down, saying it violates transgender people's rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. I don't have time to go into how these bills could be viewed in court today, but please feel free to ask those questions afterwards. Wisconsin specifically has 2 trans bills that were introduced on March 2nd by Oconomowoc Republican Representative Barbara Dittrich that are entitled Protecting Women in Sports Act. From my perspective, however, trans girls and women are the main targets of these bills. These bills and the countless others in the country are presented as feminist bills by claiming that they are protecting women. Proponents of these bills argue that trans women athletes threaten women's sports and that cisgender women are losing opportunities, titles, and scholarships to trans women because they have an unfair advantage biologically. Their reasoning for this is the assumption that trans women have higher testosterone levels and therefore greater muscle mass and height. This is seen by them as an unfair advantage in a situation that puts cis women in greater physical danger during contact sports. The problems I see in this argument are that, scientifically speaking, every person has different levels of hormones and physical characteristics no matter what gender they are. Trans athletes vary in height, weight, and athletic ability just like cis athletes do. So why are people still supporting these bills? Well, when asking Dittrich about how the governor should respond to Wisconsin's bill, she said, "I think if the governor really cares about women, he absolutely should advance this legislation, and there should be no reason why he doesn't go anywhere, unless he's a sexist." This statement implies that trans women are not women, and with only 20% of people cited as knowing someone who identifies as transgender, politicians are weaponizing people's lack of knowledge about trans people's lives and experiences. By painting these as feminist bills and using rhetoric that makes families think their cis daughters are being threatened and need protection, people are more likely to support these bills. Additionally, news and media coverage of these bills are presenting them in a way that claims that there's both sides to the argument, implying that the issue is about whether or not trans women pose a threat to women's sports. This narrative is false and harmful, as it normalizes the invalidation and hate against trans people. Trans women are women. And the real issue here is the fact that these bills are even being proposed and the harm that it's causing trans youth and families. Anti-trans legislation has surged in 2021, and I believe the results of the 2020 presidential election, as well as the diverse representation of all elected officials, have led some Republicans to focus even more on restricting trans rights as a tangible last effort of holding on to power. Currently, marginalized people are gaining equality not just through social acceptance, but also through legislation and federal policies. This summer, the Supreme Court ruled in Bostock v. Clayton County that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 includes protection of LGBTQ individuals from discrimination under the basis of the term sex. On President Biden's first day in office, he signed an executive order that affirmed these rulings and instructed federal agencies to follow them. It's the paradox of progress, though. The more visibility and protections people gain, the more the opposing side lashes back in fear. I think that the GOP is losing power, and these anti-trans bills presented in a pro-cis womanhood package are how they're trying to fight it. I find it interesting, though, that they think this is a winning agenda because even their constituents realize that these are not real issues. In a poll conducted last fall by the Human Rights Campaign and Heart Research Group, they found that throughout 10 swing states, only 1 to 3% of respondents prioritize restricting trans youth from participating in sports. Despite all this, these bills are still being introduced and passed at alarming rates. The presence of these bills in and of themselves is dangerous and deadly for trans youth. In a U.S. transgender survey, they found that in the year 2015, 43.9% of trans youth considered suicide, compared to 16.3% of cis youth. 29.7% of trans youth made at least one suicide attempt that year, compared to 7.3% of cis youth. And 59.4% of trans youth reported feeling sad or hopeless, compared to 33.5% of cis youth. These increased levels are mainly results of discrimination and stigma against trans youth's gender identities. So when they see these bills being proposed, let alone passed, it tells them even their government supports the idea that they don't have the right to be themselves. I believe that these bills also disproportionately harm trans youth of color, specifically Black trans girls. Derek Clifton, a journalist and activist on intersectional identities, has stated that for Black women in sports, no matter if they're trans, intersex, or cis, there have always been people and rules that try to diminish and reprimand them for their success. Anti-trans legislation could be a form of repackaged racial bias that allows people to use the legal protections of trans discrimination to also enforce racial discrimination. This is already visible with the cases of Terry Miller and Andrea Yearwood, who are both Black trans athletes in Connecticut on their high school track team. There was a lawsuit started by some cis athletes' families trying to ban trans women from competing in women's sports as a direct response to Miller and Yearwood winning at a state competition in 2018. People only seem to see this as an issue when they have successes, and these are often the only two cases that proponents of the bills bring up. I believe the fact that these two women are Black plays a major role in this. The policing of trans and queer bodies is connected to the policing of Black bodies, and the enforcement of one enables the other. Terry Miller has spoken out against all of this, powerfully saying, Throughout the history of sports, women have been told that there is no place for us. Black girls have been excluded and our bodies have been politicized. Trans women have been told to stay out and stop being who we are. Despite all this, I stand here today as a Black trans woman who will not stop running, and I will never stop being who I am. While having inclusion in sports is not a remedy for the persistent discrimination against trans youth, it does have many positive and life-saving effects. The Center for American Progress states that research has found that high school and college student athletes may be at a lower risk for anxiety and depression, suicide attempts, and tobacco and illegal drug use. Sports participation is also associated with increased self-esteem and self-confidence, improved academic performance, and stronger school-based social support. With trans youth being one of the most at-risk populations for mental health concerns, sports can provide these needed spaces where their bodies and abilities are celebrated, even when everyone else is telling them they don't belong. Andrea Yearwood has spoken about her experience with sports and adds, "I've known two things for most of my life. I'm a girl and I love to run. I love how running makes me feel and the way it allows me to excel at something I'm passionate about. When I'm running, I'm in the moment, I'm happy, and it makes me feel free. Sports can change our lives for the better, giving us community and the outlet we need to be mentally and physically healthy." When looking at the mental health of trans youth athletes versus non-athletes, the U.S. Transgender Survey found that in 2015, 25.4% of trans non-athletes reported having self-harmed, compared to only 21.9% of athletes. 36.6% of non-athletes reported severe psychological distress, compared to 27.9% of athletes, and 57.5% of non-athletes had considered suicide, compared to 50.2% of athletes. It's important to note, however, that while there is a decrease between trans non-athletes and athletes, these numbers are still way too high, and inclusion in sports is only one small step to supporting and helping trans youth. Many other transgender athletes have also shared the life-saving role of sports in their lives. For example, Jay Robinson, a transgender athlete who competed in equestrian throughout high school and college, shares about his experience. "I still feel like I was who I'd always been, because I was able to hold on to something that I had before my transition. Horses saved my life when I was going through my transition, and I'm sure that numerous other trans athletes can say the same for themselves. I truly cannot imagine what it would have been like if I wasn't able to ride while I was going through all of that." Sports should be a space where trans youth can feel like themselves and are treated just as an athlete. I believe that stories like Jay's and countless others demonstrate how critically important it is that trans youth have these opportunities. There are 14 states plus Washington, D.C., where K-12 schools have transgender inclusive policies that allow students to participate and compete on the teams that match their gender identity without requiring them to have a medical or legal transition. Sadly, in 5 of these states, though, there is currently legislation proposing the discriminatory policies, and those are highlighted in red here. The Center for American Progress makes clear, however, that against this legislative backdrop, it is not enough to simply avoid outright bans on transgender inclusion in sports or have no policy at all. States must be proactive in implementing inclusive policies. I believe we need policies in place that explicitly state trans athletes can compete on the team that aligns with their gender identity, and that their names and pronouns, access to resource and facilities, and privacy will all be respected. We also must include trans youth in these conversations and listen to their needs. This shows trans youth that they are seen, that they matter, and that they are loved and supported. These attacks on trans youth are also being met with strong resistance by activists, trans youth themselves, and their families. Many have turned to protesting, rallying, and sharing information on social media. There have also been open letters signed by the nation's leading child health and welfare groups, college athletes, trans youth, and the families of trans youth, telling lawmakers how harmful these bills are. This community has never been silent, and through community empowerment and support, I have confidence that these hateful bills will not prevail. I've also included in this presentation some resources for how you can help support trans youth. In Wisconsin and across the country, there are many organizations you can donate to, such as GSAFE, Dane County's New Harvest Foundation, Fair Wisconsin, and the Trans Justice Funding Project. It's also important to continue learning about trans rights issues, so I put on here a list of Instagram accounts of trans leaders that are currently organizing and educating, such as Raquel Willis, Queen Jean, Chase Strangio, and Madison's Ray Centerigi. Within their profiles, you can find even more people to follow and links to resources with more information. One way to get involved that doesn't require donating is calling and emailing representatives and governors, asking them to oppose these bills. You don't have to be a citizen of that specific state to call, and I've listed the phone numbers of some of the governors who currently have anti-trans legislation processing in their state. Aside from these transport bans, we also need to be focusing on the other bills, such as the ones blocking trans minors from accessing gender-affirming healthcare. It's important that we make a lot of noise, and that legislators hear how harmful these bills are. You can find more numbers to call, information on specific bills, and scripts for calling and emailing on any of the social media accounts listed here. We need more people aware of these harmful bills, and I hope after this presentation you start conversations with others about this, and that you take action to help support trans youth. Trans kids are kids, and we need to support and fight for their lives. Thank you. All right. Thank you. And now we have some time if anybody has any questions or comments or thoughts that they want to add.
I have a lot.
Awesome.
And I guess in part it depends on where you want to go with this. Is this a project you're interested in continuing to work on?
Yeah, I'm actually going to be working on this in the summer. So that's the plan right now.
One of the things that struck me pretty early on in the presentation, the name of the Wisconsin bill, Protecting Women in Sports Act, like that rhetoric of protecting women is rooted in a very particular racist conception of femininity that ties in really nicely with the points that you make later on about trans women of color. Right. I mean, so I think playing on that rhetoric could be really fun, right? That notion that we have to protect women. Who does the protecting and from whom exactly? White guys, it turns out, from people of color. Right?
Yep. Rooted in our history.
Exactly. So much else, right? What the heck counts as feminism? If supporting these bills are supposed to be feminist, we need to really interrogate what the heck we mean by feminism. Who's defining these terms, right?
Who are we listening to?
Who are we listening to? If we pay attention to feminists of color who have been writing since the 80s at least, actually you can trace it back to the late 1800s with Ida B. Wells, the very notion of feminism is itself up for question and contestation among women who differ from each other.
Yes.
So many interesting resources I could share with you if you want some. Oh, it's so exciting.
I would love all of them.
If you wanted more resources on the biological aspects of sex and gender, Anne Fausto Sterling is a feminist biologist who's got this really, she has a number of really fabulous books, but years ago, she wrote a piece kind of tongue-in-cheek saying, based on biology, there are at least 5 genders.
Yes.
And, she's an expert in biology, so she knows her stuff, right?
Yep. The scientists they just don't like us to know that.
Right. Well, the narrative of binary gender is endemic to Western systems of power rooted in race, gender, class, and sexuality. Right? Many of us have drunk the Kool-Aid. Frankly, sorry, I was taken to task for using that phrase recently, so I apologize. It is kind of a gross reference. But one more. Hang on. I was just looking at it.
This will keep happening.
Sex Texting is a book about, the subtitle is Gender Policing in Women's Sports. And it's about the shifting criteria for trying to define who counts as a woman in international sports. It's been really hard to do because hormones don't work, chromosomes don't work, right? So years ago, they went with a panty check. They tried to be more sophisticated. More sophistication didn't work. They went back to panty checks. Which, of course, completely ignores and erases intersex folks.
Yes.
Right? So, I mean, there's just so much you could do with this. And then after this, I'm going to shut up. I swear. Julie and Jill Peterson has a book called Histories of the Transgender Child. She wrote a piece in the Times recently in response to the bills that are meant to prevent gender-affirming care for trans kids, addressing the concern, addressing the assumption that these technologies are sort of new and that trans girls cis girls are having these pressures put on them to become boys, and it's going to be bad for them, et cetera, et cetera. She says, honey, trans kids have existed for as long as human history. Take a deep breath. Get over yourself.
Yep.
So I'd be happy to send you a list of things, and now I'll stop.
Yes, I would love that. Thank you so much.
Lisa, would you share that in the chat for everybody?
Absolutely. Just a list of books. Shall I start there?
Yes.
You got it.
Anybody else have some thoughts or questions?
Other than you're scratching the tip of the iceberg, and I think you're diving in very well and very bravely, Abby. This is a time where there are a lot of shifting sands in our community, and I think you did a very nice job tying in how the politics of what's been going on for the last several years is really influencing this, and the grasping at straws phenomenon is certainly a part of this, but unfortunately, until we get more education out there, there are a lot of people who do buy in to some of this, and it's like wildfire right now. But good on you, and I'm so glad that you're undertaking this for the next however many years, 3 years of your time with us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and it's just that idea of too, like, you know, these politicians and legislators, like, they're not even thinking, right? These are children's lives. They're just thinking about themselves or, you know, the power. And a lot of people are, yeah, like you said, are buying into this. And it's just horrifying when these are literally children's lives and families' lives. So.
Absolutely. We had a discussion here recently, a few of us, because I know of a friend of mine whose child is trans as well, and is an athlete, and we're going to tour Edgewood. And when they spoke to the powers that be in the athletic department, and when they asked the question, what shower facilities do you have? What changing facilities do you have for my child? Guess what the answer was? We don't have them. So this is something that you might want to think about internally as well as externally as you go forward on your project.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, that's to another issue, right? Access to these facilities and also resources. You know, I mean, first off, we want to make sure that we're protecting trans women from being able to participate, but then once they are able, you know, what's set in place to ensure that it's a safe and affirming environment for them. I think that's another really important issue about this.
Hi, Abby. My son had a question. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, so I was wondering, so things about the like trans athletes, because I guess they're saying it's like unfair. So like, do they really have like much actual evidence of it, or are they just generally against LGBTQ people?
You got it. They do not actually have any evidence at all. They're just, yeah, really against them. And, you know, they're buying off the assumption that men are inherently stronger than women, which biologically is not backed up by anything. Thank you for that.
That's why I hate the world. Okay, fine. I hate society.
I think he came in when you were giving the example of those two runners, and you were saying that you always hear that example being used, and so we were wondering, like, if that one is being used preferentially because they won, but that it's not like universal that trans athletes are always winning these competitions.
Exactly. And they're not. And again, that's another issue. They only seem to, think of it as an issue when a trans athlete does win or does succeed in something.
I'll try to come up with this person's name. I can't remember it. There's a writer for The Nation who has argued that we should just actually get rid of the sex distinction in sports entirely, that there's no good reason to keep it at all, which I think freaks a lot of people out, but it would be really interesting to pursue that possibility.
Yeah, well, and then too, that's more inclusive of everybody, right? Because with these bills, we're still talking like, binary division of female and male sports, right? And that's excluding so many people. So yes, I definitely agree with that. But it scares people.
And that itself is fascinating to consider, right? What is it that is so scary about the idea that we might actually fundamentally challenge the sex gender binary, right? Like, what exactly is scary about that?
Yeah.
It's fascinating. It is fascinating. And if you think about it, it's written into so many of our social structures, like bathrooms, that you can see how deep it goes, and that depth might be part of the scariness.
Yeah. Well, and then also too, if you look at it from like the money side, right? All these like merchandise and companies, right? That's how they make money, is by having this division and having these separate products.
Can I say that being old has its advantages here? There was a movement not all that long ago for gender non-specific clothing. And this is another really interesting book. Post 9/11, narrow gender norms reemerged as dominant cultural requirements in the marketplace, in all kinds. And before that, like when my niece, who is now 30, was a kid, it was pretty easy to buy non-pink stuff for babies, for baby girls. It's hard to do that now. It's hard to find something between the pink and the blue. It's fascinating how things have actually become more rigid than I think when I was your age.
That is really interesting.
Sorry, that doesn't help. Your project is just making me think of so many things, and I should shut up. But yeah.
No, I love it. I love it.
Ben has another question.
Sorry, so as to Colin, so like you were saying, I think it's interesting with like the bathrooms and the sports and stuff. I always thought it's really dumb. It's like one of the things we talk about a lot in the world is there's a trying to like be inclusive and not be like racist or sexist or any of the other issues. But like I feel like we still like want like go to like one gender bathrooms or like one gender sports. I feel like we should, we're saying we should just like get rid of that because like there's not that much of a point to it really, to be honest with you.
Yes, that was beautifully said, Ben. Thank you. Yeah, and again, being inclusive of all genders. And, because there is not just two genders, right? That's not even a debate. That's just a fact. So then why are we still having all of these bathrooms and sports? And like you were saying, that's still very excluding other people. I'm ready to see what you do, Ben, in the world. I'm excited for it. I can tell.
I think we need to clone Ben about a bajillion times.
Yes. How old are you, Ben?
12.
He's in 6th grade.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for your presentation. This was really excellent. You can see it got both of us thinking and interested in the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, we're going to have to head out now, but thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
off to Abby, but well done. And you know where we are if you need any further resources, clearly.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you
thank
so
you so
much.
much, Abby. I hope we will,
Thank you.
let's stay in touch and let me know if you need anything else.
Yes, for sure. Thank you so much.
Oh, my genuine pleasure and joy.
I know. I feel the same way, Lisa. This was just what I needed on the heels of a rough week. You
Yes.
brought it home and hit a home run, Abby. It gave me some good stuff to talk over with my SO tonight. It's going to be a fun dinner.
Woohoo!
Awesome. Glad to hear.
All right.
Have a
See you later, everybody.
weekend. Peace out.
Bye.